parts film, one part by Pier Paolo Pasolini, the other part by Gorin, and a third part which is a lecture by Jean-Pierre Gorin. Please welcome with me Jean-Pierre Gorin. He's going to talk to you.
The film and saying to myself, my God, what a crazy thing to even want to talk about this film. It's really a complicated film in some way. Okay, I don't like to talk about them at length before you've seen it. Just two things. I mean, it's a film that Pasolini gets to by via of a guy named Ferranti, who was the owner of what was the newsreel, that you showed in theaters. So he starts doing the film, and the producer, Ferranti, panics when the film is done, and he decides to balance it, quote unquote, and give to Guareschi, who was a writer and a guy who was quite famous for a series of films that were adapted to a very rather successful film series of Don Camillo and Pepin films. He gives them a counterpart, a counterpoint of view. Pasolini gets quite irate about it, but at the same time accepts it, very secure in some ways that he would look quite good next to what's coming. And that's exactly what happens. The film bombed. It was seen only for a few days in Italy, and then reappeared far later, 20 years later. So look at it, and then we'll talk about it. Some notes. Yeah. The other one is better. How do you take those two? I think the way to get into it is through the voice. And in English, in French, it's called voix off, meaning by that the off as some sort of scent of a theater, as if there was a commentator outside on the aisles looking at the material and throwing his thing on it. And in English it's voice over, which literally has this sense of covering it like the lid of a coffin. Voice over, this idea if it's a little too cooked. And we've got one of the two films which is true to this kind of conception of the voiceover. And it's the Guareschi, which has this slab of ignominious ideas about the inferiorities of black, or the horrors of totalitarian thoughts, war, etc., etc. It's a very classical 1950s discourse about all that stuff. But when you look at the Pasolini film, it's something far more complicated that happens, because the voice is not a voice; it's three voices. It's one which is, in fact, the voice of Guareschi in some way. He doesn't know that he's coming, but it's the voice that's attached to these types of newsreel that he uses, and that has that peculiar ring of a kind of rancid ideological discourse that wants to nail it, and to nail it right at every moment. And then there's this very brilliant move that he makes to divide the voice, his voice, between two things. One which he calls literally, that he gives to two of his friends. And there's one which he calls prose, and he gave it to a friend of his who was a painter. And it's kind of polemical and harsh in some ways. And it does all sorts of riffs on the material and against the material. And then there's another voice, which is a voice that he calls poetry, and that he gives to another good friend of his. Bassani was a very good, a very well-known writer and poet. So that the voice in the Pasolini film splits itself in three instances. It becomes a polysemy or a polyphony, to sound a little pedantic. But then the O of the voice off or voice over, becomes something else, which is really something that filmmakers know when they're good, which is that the voice cannot be over or cannot be off. It has to be oblique. It has to hit the material at an angle, like a hit and run. It cannot float over the material in a kind of redundant tautological relationship, or it can't be to the side of it, presiding over it as some sort of minor god. But it has to be this thing that creates, by its obliqueness to the material, creates something between the material and the voice. And then you get into the complexity of the project, which he undertakes at a peculiar time, and it's a project that's never going to leave him. I mean, he's done two films. First film that every filmmaker, or every young filmmaker should hope to do, that's Agatone. And he's done Mama Roma, and he's done a short film, which is in fact quite linked to this one, which is called La Ricotta, where there is, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's about the shooting of a film on the Golgotha and the last moments of Christ, seen from the perspective of an extra, and which, among other things, include a whole series of meditation on art and cinema in it. But he's doing something. We're talking about 1962, 63. I mean, it's taking on a project which is kind of enormous in some ways, which is that it's not the idea that you create by a documentary gesture a material that fits what you want to say. It's that you exist in a relationship to material already existing, and that has been shot with different intentions. And it's a moment in the history of cinema where filmmakers, not only Pasolini but also Godard, etc., are starting to face this moment of the history of the medium that's going to really change it. Was that for a filmmaker at that point, it's the realization that you can't make images anymore. There's been such a plethora of images created. There's been such an accumulation that, in fact, an image is not anymore as it was at the beginning of the history of cinema, as it was in the times of Lumière and all those old guys. It was an image of the world. But now it's not an image of the world anymore. It's an image of an image, which happens to be through that double chain and a possible image of the world. So that there is, I think, that the stuff that excited him, and you hear it in the voice. You hear it in this voice that ultimately, in its division between three levels, establishes an equation which is in and of itself revolutionary, which is the equation of the P word. Politics equals poetics. They're not separate.
It's not the discourse of rationality versus the discourse of inspiration. It's two things that work together. Two things that work together because they don't have the same speed, but they still obliquely try to cut a path into the elements of the real that are given to us. So he's engaged in something which is quite extraordinary, which is this idea of appropriating material and redirecting it. And he's going to do that several times. He's going to do that when he does Uccellini, which is one of his greatest films, which entertained constantly this kind of dialogue that he had between images of the real and images of images, and ends up with this grand lyrical documentary moment on the death of Togliatti in the streets of Rome. But he also does that at the end when he makes this, seminal end of film of the 60s, which is Salò. It's not simply the end of the 60s, it's the end of the 18th century and the 19th and the 20th. So what's at stake in this film is really something that really is both quite ancient, back to someone like Vertov was the first one to have put aside the word documentary and in fact introduced in one fashion or another the idea of media that we live off. And it's a project also quite modern, which is to ask oneself, practically, by doing all those manipulations, something that some have called, or that I will call, what is the imagination, or what is the imaginary of the database? What is that kind of modern imaginary that exists in a gesture of recycling, reinterpretation, changing, etc., of existing material that's hijacked constantly? And where the film is kind of difficult, and I didn't do it, I'm a lazy bastard, so I pretend to be lecturing, but you would have to do something which you see Guareschi not doing. Guareschi is a guy who goes wholesale. He takes these segments that the newsreels of the producer give him, and he uses them wholesale, and he puts them together, and he ladles that with this pseudo-ironic discourse. But the operation of editing in the case of Pasolini is far more complicated, and you would have to really study it at the editing table. And it's, again, several operations. What he uses wholesale, what he stops, and what he changes. So that there is a series of editing gestures. It's not simply, all they say, what great writer he was. That's generally a way not to say what the great writing is made of. And what I suggest is the great writing is not simply the lyricism of it. God knows, I wish I could write like that. Or I wish Debord would have had the good idea to write like that. 20 years later, he'll write like Bossuet or Feydeau. But Pasolini writes differently, and the difference in the writing is this position of the voice in relationship to the material, and the operations of editing that happen. Because the whole problem of editing for a filmmaker dealing with this kind of voice oblique is, how do you create space, and how do you do on a material that has been shot by something else, do you do the thing that is essential to the cinematographic image? The cinematographic image is not simply something that shows you something. It's that gesture that enables the image to exist beyond itself. There's always a problematic, which is the problematic of surplus value, emotional, etc. in the image. The image is like a wave. You've got to show, it shows, but it also has to crest on itself, like a wave. It also has to create this moment where the spectator is at a distance of it to see how the image, to become an image of cinema, can resonate over itself. So the problem of Pasolini all the time is to create that resonance, to create that moment, that space, that moment where you're both in and looking, and at a distance that enable you to literally look at that material and seize a moment which is quite miraculous, in fact, which is the moment where Pasolini steals the material away from the people that have created and makes it absolutely uniquely his. And that is what this film is about. It's a kind of there's water. At least there are 10 people that have left. I'm going to end up with 3 people, but don't worry, I'm starting to warm up. Is there water somewhere? Oh, there's beer somewhere. Somebody left it. I think it's me. So, he hijacks as a filmmaker. He creates a space in which this thing resonates. That creation of that space is something which has to do with a series of operations at the editing that kind of slow down or that kind of change. I mean, 2 examples where it changes radically is this wonderful moment where in front of all this dreadful social realist painting, the docent, the guy who is showing them, becomes the surrogate of a discourse, which is, a discourse about burning all those paintings and about the failure of Janovist, Janov art, A-R-T. And the end where he does this ending, which is this wonderful return of Icarus, and where the image is seen through the capsule of Titov, the cosmonaut. He didn't take Gagarin, he took Titov, the guy who went 3 times or 17 times, I don't remember. I was too young to remember that. No, I wasn't too young, in fact. I was already quite old. But it changes the landscape. And it changes the landscape with some moment. For you Pasolini freaks out there, there's a moment where he quotes himself. He quotes the painting out of which he does the variation in Laricota between the tableau vivant and the preparation of the tableau. So, but you would have to understand the film really. I haven't done it, and most likely I won't do it. But you'd have to study exactly length and exactly the nature of the cuts every time, and you would get this series of moments where the materials start to move and to change and to resonate. So it's not simply the qualification by the word, blah blah blah. I'm repeating myself, but I hope you get it. So, I don't know, somebody wants to ask you a question. Yeah, please.
Why are they referring to the same actions and the same scene?
Well, because the guy, the producer, pulled the trick. I mean, he got panicked at the idea. Most likely, panic is a big word. He had this most likely, like all those cases. And it's been my case when I was working with Jean-Luc. They get panicked at the idea that nobody's going to understand what the fuck you're doing. So it's the panic of the imbeciles. And he decided that it would be great if with the same material, which was the material that he had, and on the same years, they, Guareschi would produce the antithesis of that thesis. And of course, Pasolini denounced him very violently for that. But at the same time, I get the sense that from
from some letters that he wrote and some stuff that he did, he absolutely knew what a gift that was. You know, I mean, and of course, the stuff that changes the thing is that, you know, Guareschi is the guy who finishes the film, so he leaves you with the last impression on it. And the period, chance or not, I mean, the period is a very crucial period. I mean, you know, basically it covers 52 to 62. So it's a kind of crucial moment of both the Cold War, the anti-colonial movement, etc., etc. But look, at the end of it, what's really interesting to me, I mean, in some ways, the film is here because of me and because Hans accepted to show it. But in some fashion, I don't want to get into a discourse where because I'm this antiquated dinosaur, can basically name every image and tell you the events to which they correspond. There's two things. I mean, one cannot also kill the film by enshrining it in some sort of discourse about Pasolini. And in fact, the problem is not the Guareschi, which is fairly easy to nail, but you have to keep this film alive, and that's several operations really. One would be to suppress the Guareschi and put any standard documentary produced today next to that film in the second part. Whatever they talk about, you know, this kind of all this stuff that's all over the place now, which is this kind of Hegelian anguish consciousness that tell us the world is a horrible place to live in. And that's that setup, which is so ignominious, this idea of the testimony, that concept of the testimony, that constant warranting in a talking head of the reality of the things that you say. Okay? So if you put anything that has been produced now, anything that's in this festival next to that, you get the sense of what kind of a war machine the film of Pasolini is. You know, and how much it's actual in the sense that it blows out of the water the ideology of documentary, and the focusing on content that goes with it. The second thing which was interesting for me, that, you know, it's me trying to make a film every 20 years. It's, I think, for all the operations of hijacking that he does, and the complexity of those operations, if Pasolini had to do the same thing now, it would be completely incapable of doing it. Why? Because you see very clearly that one of the things that facilitates the operation, and it's very conscious of it, what allows this positioning of the voice, what allows this cresting of the image upon itself, is the fact that people at that time, guys who were making films at that time, had still a very, very strong sense of framing. And those images are framed in a very classical fashion, so they allow the operation that he does. But that if you had to do with a kind of soup that passes for images today, you know, I mean, the fundamental mistake or the fundamental error of political cinema today is that the people who do it are persuaded that they talk to the deaf, D-A-F, the people who don't hear. So they have this soundtrack of people yelling like crazy and telling you outside of this theater where we're all feeling very cozy, by the way, because we have the same ideas that the ideas expressed in the screen. Outside, there's a world which is horrible against, if only people could hear us, then everything would be fine. But the reality is they're not talking to the deaf, they're talking to the blind. That's very different. They're talking to the blind because the history of film, the history of the medium,
has gone to this point where the problematic of framing has been totally changed. And it has been changed by one television, which doesn't exist at the moment, where he makes this film, and which he talks in very, very cogent terms, because he shows it. He shows it in relationship to this, at the moment it appears in the Soviet Union, place among which in the good old days, before Lenin decided that, he said, well, I'm all for avant-garde, but what kind of the music I personally like is military music, which really fucked us up for the next 50 years after that. But you see that the way he sets it up, he is really doing this. You know, I'm talking about the Russia of the experimentations of the early years of the revolution. You know, of Medvedkin and his train, you know, of Vertov, of the guys of the Fex, etc. And he builds up this whole discourse about the birth, in fact, of popular culture, which is a very recent term. I mean, popular culture is what? It has nothing to do with the people. It's not popular. It's industrial. That's a very big difference. And before that, there was this other formation, which is called folk culture, which is, for whatever it was, functioned radically differently. So it's a film done by a guy who's working on material that exists prior to the idea and to the practice of television, which brought in a kind of massive centering of the image. And if you center the image, if you have this thing at the center, which always looks, i.e., if in the television, you know, this thing that I always had that has a triad, which is cinema. You were either far away, closer in, and closer than closer in. And it's those three positions that enable to build this very complex, these complex machines of vision. But television being either closer in or medium closer in, suppressed and brought everything at the center. And also, it suppressed, you edit, this is technical, but you edit by the edge, you don't edit by the center. And if you have a figure at the center, the space around it is neutral. So the relationship, the stuff that makes cinema, which is this constant system of delay by which you know that you're going to surrender to the center, but you try to avoid it, got suppressed. And you've got something which appeared at the center and has this kind of urgency of being shown and hitting you in the face. The other system that created that and transformed cinema is pornography. Pornography and television function in the same way. And you don't have to see dicks and cuts to, in fact, being looking at a pornographic film, which is most of the films that we see. They're big centered machines that absolutely do not suppress this idea that the one grand dimension of cinema was to make space. You know, the essential dramatic notion. And if you talk space, it's not simply, it's three things. If you go do, as many farmers would say, a textbook on space, cinematographic space 101, it's space as the space of the screen, it's space as the psychological space created for the actor, and it's space as the path that within the terrain of the film, a filmmaker carves out. It's three types of space. So, this is a film from prior to television. Blah, 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 blah. I could speak for a long fucking time. But why don't you ask me some questions outside of that? I'll give you €2 for that question. Yes.
What we call framing, can I also take it as showing this Apollonius' personal attitude towards these topics?
Well, I think it's because he has material which is framed, and because he doesn't buy it wholesale, and he does operation on it, the material transforms itself. And what you start becoming aware is not the whole ideological sequence, but it's something which are in fact very minute details, and I really have to do with cinema. He becomes aware of bodies, and he becomes aware of faces, and he'll take you into a place, and he'll pay this kind of extraordinary homage to cinema, an extraordinary homage to the person who has the anonymous DP, director of photography, who's filmed the material. That's the scene where you see all these women waiting. It's obviously, a kind of accident in a mine where the corpses are coming back. And he works on it so that the beauty of those faces and the way they're framed and the lyricism of the stuff comes at you in a very, very vivid way. Yeah.
But I think it's kind of look at people is a kind of friendly.
What kind of what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Kind of what?
Friendly. It's a warm.
Oh. It's the one thing about Pasolini which is extraordinary is that he is really a filmmaker of, I wouldn't say love, but he's a filmmaker of desire. And it's not that whatever his sexual proclivities, and God knows, he got spit at and a lot for those. But I mean, Pasolini is the guy who, even if you're a card-carrying heterosexual, will make you understand what it is to desire someone of the same sex. But he also would make you desire, a dog, a fire hydrant. There's so much sense of it's not love. It's beyond that. I mean, he has a way to set up a kind of God knows if I was able to do that, I would do it every 5 seconds. Yeah.
Do you know something more about the historical background of the production of the setting of the movie and the 2 movies?
Yeah.
Because for me, nowadays, it sounds really absurd to have the initial question of the film and to have 2 filmmakers to really, in every possible way, to try to deal with the question, to find an answer in using the material and in using poetical comments. And so I think nowadays you couldn't find somebody to make a film for answering this initial question.
You kidding? Every goddamn documentary on the blog is trying to answer those kind of questions.
In fact, this kind of question, starting with...
But look, here I have to confess to something, and it's not by some sort of shyness that people are very, very incapable to see that I'm shy. But there's a place where I don't go. I'm not interested in some sort of academic understanding of all the circumstances of a film. My questioning is very practical to me. I'm a filmmaker. I'm someone who chose to live in exile. I don't mind seeing a film without understanding the language or not knowing what the concrete events are about. I think there's something about this film now, today, which has, I showed it to some students of mine, and some young woman said, well, it feels like I'm an immigrant. It feels like it's something, it's some country that somehow I know that I've left, but I don't quite know what it is. And I think it's a very interesting feeling. I don't think that personally, as a filmmaker, I don't gain much from knowing. I like not to know.
I like the fact that there's holes. I like the fact that, you know, I was trained by a guy named Godard who always said great films are films where you fall asleep and then you wake up and it's the same thing. I like that kind of relationship.
Have done a film with answering this question.
What?
What do you think? Would Godard have done the film with the same question?
I think the one thing that the only thing that I profoundly regret is that he did this trailer for the Viennale. And if there was a place where this trailer should have been put, it's before the Pasolini film. Because you would have seen the kind of dialogue that two great filmmakers have with each other, which I really think is something that you don't see much of today, where, you know, every filmmaker comes in front of you guys and he looks like a bureaucrat from the great factory of filmmaking. But people like Godard and Pasolini, or people like Vertov and Godard, entertain some sort of dialogue over the years in relationship to their work. And I think it would have been absolutely amazing to see Catastrophe with this thing. Ciao.